About 2 years ago, Krishnan Rajeshwar called me, asked me whether I would give one of the society lectures. And I said, sure, why not? Now, I didn't know what I will be talking about. And I thought, well, I will be talking about my work. 4 years ago, however, I was asked to serve on an international panel on global warming, and I had to learn about global warming. A year ago, I was speaking to a class of graduate students, 80 graduate students, of one of the absolute top universities in the world, and these were engineering students. And to my utter surprise, I found that none in the class of 80 students understood the drivers of global warming. And then I started to think, why do these students not understand the drivers of global warming? When you ask them what drives global warming, the answer was people don't conserve energy, they don't use enough solar energy, we don't have a carbon tax. So why in the world don't know it? Why don't they not know it? Why don't they not know it? Well, it turns out that when you look at the press and when you look at the statements of the political leaders of the world, none of them ever discusses what drives the global warming. Now, the answer is extremely simple. What drives the global warming is the increase in global wealth. As simple as that. In the industrial age, global wealth, as measured by products and services, has increased by a factor of 250. Now, when people emerge from poverty, when people can afford the basics, when they move to prosperity, they consume more and more energy. Initially, you walk, then you ride a bicycle made out of steel, then you ride a motor bicycle, then you drive a car. Initially, you live in an extremely simple hut made of wood. Then you live in a house or an apartment, and now you are using cement, you are using steel. Ladies and gentlemen, 13% of the world's carbon dioxide emission comes from two industries: steel and cement. 13%. Now let's put this in perspective of how much energy are we saving annually by all of our use of solar energy. 0.3%, ladies and gentlemen. Now, nothing is more important than to understand the drivers of global warming and understand the significance of what all of us are doing here. We are developing the counter drivers. We are developing the means to conserve energy, to use solar energy, to use wind, to use batteries, to use hybrid cars, to use electric cars, to reduce our energy consumption. That's what we are doing. That's what the Electrochemical Society is about. Or to reduce corrosion that necessitates the production, because of the production of steel of 8% of all carbon dioxide emitted. So this is what we are about. Today, we will have a very hard look. All of my lectures will be graphs and numbers to tell you how much the accumulation of wealth by people is driving the carbon dioxide emissions, and how much are we actually saving by conservation and by renewables. And you will see that there is a huge gap. To be specific, we save only 9% of the energy that we use through everything that we use do in conservation and renewables. We are increasing as a result, accelerating as a result, every year, the carbon dioxide emissions by 2%. Every year, the carbon dioxide emissions are accelerating by 2%. Now, this will necessarily lead to a catastrophe. And the question is, what do we do about the catastrophe? Well, number one, let there be no mistake. On the long run, we will continue to develop alternative energy sources, and in some time in the future, we will be using exclusively what we now call alternative energy sources. That's what humanity will have. We will continue to conserve energy, and by doing so, we will stop first the acceleration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then we will have it level off. But it will take decades before we stop the acceleration, and it will take maybe a century before we stop the increase in emissions. So we are talking about a very long period of time, very long period, and in this period, in this transitory period, we need to do something. The only thing that we know how to do, or maybe learn how to do, we really don't know how to do. And that's what I'm going to talk about also. We will need to learn something about geoengineering. We will need to learn something about reflecting light to the sun through aerosols in the stratosphere. We will need to learn something about enhancing reflection from clouds. We will need something to do something by increasing photosynthesis in the oceans. These things, every one of these three has precipitated in the past an ice age, so we know that they can happen. And the question is whether we can do it in a responsible way, in an environmentally friendly way, and in a controllable way. So now you heard my entire lecture. The rest is just detail. So the first thing that I want you to be aware of, that the atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions are not rising, they're accelerating. Here is the curve. This is updated as of last month. So look at the curve between 1960 and 1970, look at the slope. Look at the slope between 1980 and 1990. Look at the slope today. It tells you the story. This is the problem. We continue to accelerate. It's not that we are not leveling off. We are not continuing to emit at a steady rate. We are accelerating. We are accelerating. And this in spite of all the talk about conservation, about renewables. Now, The acceleration is in spite of our extreme success in conservation of energy and shifting to renewables. You will see later that in the United States in the past 20 years, our emissions did no longer increase. The increase comes from parts of the world where people are still very poor or people just emerge from poverty. So today, we are balancing only 9% of the global wealth associated rise in CO2. As a result, atmospheric CO2 is accelerating at 2% per year. It might take decades of research, development, and engineering before this acceleration stops, and it could take a century before the increase stops. The gap could lead to a catastrophe, and we, members of the Electrochemical Society, should start thinking about preventing that catastrophe. Now, the public today is absolutely not ready to accept the alternative, or accept, not an alternative, to accept the complementing conservation and renewables with engineering the climate. So we are all accepting that it's good to conserve. We are all accepting that renewables are wonderful, and none of us is yet consciously accepting that we need to think, in addition to renewables and in addition to conservation, which are our only long-term solution, we need to think already today about climate engineering. We don't need to implement climate engineering. We don't want to start climate engineering, but we must start research, development, and engineering so that we have it ready when the time comes. This is what you heard from Maria van der Hoeven. She's the executive director of the International Energy Agency. Just read what she has said this year. We have certain targets. None has been met. No, none of the targets of the IAE is being met. This is the situation today. Now, the relationship between global wealth and carbon dioxide emissions has been studied by some very, very great economists. And the leading economist who studied it was Yoichi Kaya. Yoichi Kaya established what every energy economist knows, the Kaya equality, the Kaya equation, and it's a terribly simple equation, except it has profound thinking behind it. It says CO2 will be emitted. The only thing that you can do is improve the number of dollars that you produce per unit CO2 emission, because people will want to come richer. People will want to have larger families. And if that's the case, the only thing that you can do is to create more wealth per unit carbon dioxide emission. This is what Yoichi Kaya was teaching. And let's now look at the numbers. It's absolutely ridiculous. Between 1965 and 2014, the world's GDP, that's gross domestic product, which includes all services and all industrially manufactured products, increased by 1,100%. We increased 11-fold the wealth of the world in this 50-year period. And the world carbon intensity improved only by 12%. So this tells you the story on how severe the situation is. Here is where we were in 1960. The world's gross domestic product was $5 trillion. In 2014, it was $58 trillion, an increase by a factor of 12. And here is what we actually saved. This is on the left, the red color is the total energy consumed. The right color, the blue color on the right, is the trillion US dollars in constant dollars of the world GDP. The curves are practically track each other with a difference of 9% that comes from energy conservation and use of renewables. Here is the global per capita GDP. This is per individual in the world. And on the average, an individual in the world got about 4 times richer in this period. And here you see the population of the world. In the same period, the population of the world approximately increased by a factor of 2.5. So you multiply the number of people in the world with the per capita GDP, and you get the acceleration. This is what accelerates, this is what drives the global carbon dioxide increase. Ladies and gentlemen, you didn't hear President Obama or any of the prime ministers of the world say a word about population increase in the context of global warming. Ladies and gentlemen, you didn't hear any of the politicians say a word about people emerging from poverty. You didn't hear anything about any of these subjects from the press. We have suppressed it. It was not politically correct to discuss these. It's time to make it politically correct. This is the curve that shows what we have accomplished through renewables, what we have accomplished through energy conservation. This is Kaya's carbon intensity, how much goods we produce. And you see per unit dollar, per dollar, and you see that in the same period, we decrease this from 0.85 to 0.75. It's about 10–12%. This is all we could do. This is all we could do. So let there be no if, but, and however. We are increasing the carbon dioxide level, and as long as people will seek to improve their lot, which they will always do, and as long as people will seek to have larger families, which they do, this will not change. This is the net result. The billion metric tons of oil equivalent that the world consumes, and you see that between '82 and today, it doubled. With all the conservation, with all the solar, with all the wind. And this is the last of my slides in this series. This shows the most recent acceleration. And you see that in the recent time periods, even if you look between 2011 and 2012, or 2012 and 2013, the emissions have increased by 2%. Now, where are we in the United States? And in the United States, in spite of the fact that we like to blame ourselves of not doing well enough, we are one of the extremely few societies of the world that's actually doing well. We have stabilized in the past 20 years our carbon dioxide emissions, even though our wealth increased and even though our population increased. We were successful. However, and here is the catch, we stabilized the CO2 emissions at a level that was 3.5 times higher than the global average per capita. Okay, so it's doable, it will happen, but not where we are now today. This is the real GDP chart of the United States, and as you see, in 1960, the GDP per capita, the real GDP of the United States was approximately $3 trillion, and today it's about $15 trillion. And at the same time, look at this beautiful curve. In the United States, between 1995 and 2014, the CO2 emissions remained level. There was no increase. So the bottom, what's the message here? The message is that through renewables and through energy conservation, we will succeed in stabilizing the carbon dioxide emissions. It's doable, but it's going to take a very long time for it to happen because of the transience of the world. The United States is emitting today a pretty small fraction of the world's CO2, even though it emits 3.5 times more than the average. The United States emits today only 7% of all the CO2 in the world. So it's not enough. It's not enough that we have stabilized our CO2 emissions. This is the best and most impressive curve that you see. Look at this absolutely dramatic decrease in the carbon intensity of the US economy. You saw earlier that in the world, we decreased the carbon intensity by 12%. Here, look at the period between, on the left, I'm showing around 1950, on the right, I'm showing 2012, and you see dropping the carbon intensity a factor of 5. Fantastic. Very, very successful, but not enough to change the world's balance. And this is, of course, the reason for it. When you look at the populations and where they are in their carbon dioxide emissions, you immediately see the societies that are emerging from poverty and are going on through having some property to actually accumulating wealth and becoming prosperous. It's a long process. It will continue for decades, and it's good that it is continuing for decades. There is nothing wrong with it. It should continue, and we wish that it will continue, but we cannot fight it. So now we come to the last part. We either let the world continue to warm up, or we will do some transient geoengineering. So if some decades from now, we have no choice but for a short period of time, of some decades or maybe a century, we do have to reflect sunlight, or we do have to fertilize oceans, we should be ready for it. We must be ready to avert a possible ecological disaster by complementing the successful energy conservation and renewable energy research and development. Please don't think for a second that I am saying that we should give up on working on renewables, on working on conserving. This is our prime objective. At the same time, I'm saying we have the danger of a catastrophe, and we must complement it on an equal basis with studying geoengineering. We have no choice. What are the options? There are three options today that are sensible. Each of them, at one time or another, has caused an ice age. So it's not an issue whether they work. They do work. The question is whether we can make them work in a rigorously controlled way, whether we will do the engineering that we need so that we don't create a catastrophe. So, number one, we can reflect light by particulates and aerosols. And today, not knowing any better, not because this has been studied in depth, none of this has been studied in depth. People are talking about reflecting light with sulfur compounds. You ask me why sulfur compounds, I cannot answer the question. Nobody can answer it. That's what we studied. That's what the volcanoes emitted, and we know that they work. Now, would some other particulate be better? Would it be more controllable? We need to find out. The second thing that we can do is to enhance the reflectivity of clouds. And here the option is, the simplest option is to spray seawater in the atmosphere. When they nucleate with salt the clouds, we nucleate drop formation, we reflect more light. Either of these two could do enough to allow us to double the amount of CO2 that we produce, to balance the CO2 that we produce if we double it. So they're good enough. The third option is an exceptionally interesting one, and it's the iron fertilization of the southern oceans. John Martin discovered that widespread iron limitation of ocean photosynthesis prevents the growth of photosynthesizing organisms in the southern oceans. The northern oceans get enough iron from dust, with winds blowing from continents. The southern oceans do not. It's in the northern continents only that dust-borne iron provides about 100 parts per million of iron to the oceans and allows the phytoplankton to grow. Now, whether or not this did cause an ice age has been debated, and the decisive paper on this was published last year in Science by a group of Swiss glaciologists, and they found a perfect correlation between the iron dust, between the decrease in the temperature in the ice ages, and we have now a perfect certainty that adding iron to the southern oceans will stop the global warming. I am citing here the paper for in case some of you want to read it. Now, what do we as scientists and engineers need to do? What are our primary objectives? The first thing that we want to do is you don't want to implement or think of implementing anything that's not perfectly reversible. So whatever we do, we want to make reversible. We have to engineer it for perfect reversibility. We have to have geographically and spatially resolved control. Where are we going to change the climate and how much? We need temporal management. When are we going to change the climate? And we need the tools for rapid monitoring, for the feedback at all levels. This society, members of our society, the Electrochemical Society, are perfectly well prepared to participate in this effort. When you consider any corroding system, when you consider a battery, when you consider electroplating, when you consider electroetching, you talk about transport. We are experts in transport. We know how to measure and transport, measure fluxes and model fluxes. We have extreme experience, superb experience in engineering control agents. We are engineering particles. We control their size, their chemistry, the kinetics of aggregation, disaggregation. Any of you who worked on dye-sensitized solar cells knows exactly what I'm talking about. We are engineering small particles, and we know how to do it. We talk about dispersions, we talk about dispersibility, precipitation, delivery, photochemical dissolution. I certainly did a lot of it myself. And reactivity. We need to design the half-life. This is what we, members of the Electrochemical Society, can do. So let me now come to the touchy issue. The world's governments are very much influenced by the environmental movements, and it's right for them to be influenced by the environmental movements. The people of the environmental movements are not necessarily good scientists or engineers. And as far as they are concerned, there is a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is if you don't interfere with habitats, if you don't change fauna, if you don't change flora, that's good. Anything that you do to change flora and fauna is bad. The minute that we talk about climate engineering, you will change flora and you will change fauna. Except that today, this is already happening because of global warming. So the question is, how far do you let it happen? How far do you let it go before you intervene? I'm not here to make that decision. I'm here to say that the public needs to know about the option of climate engineering, and the public needs to understand what the risks are, what the advantages are, and the public will need sooner or later to decide whether to implement it. And that will depend very much on the magnitude of the catastrophe that we will be facing. If the catastrophe is not big, the public will say don't. If the catastrophe is big, people will jump on it. Look at this map. This map shows the ecological impact of a recent ice age. It shows the map on the left. The ice age 18,000 years ago, and on the right, the modern day interglacial period. Ladies and gentlemen, by changing from one period to another, you wipe out 60% of the plants and the animals. So by changing climate, we are causing extreme damage. And then the question is, how much and to what extent and when can we alleviate it by climate control? Each of us will have to decide it for himself and for herself each of us will have to educate our friends and families on this. This is what you hear today from leaders of the environmental movements. I'm quoting here Steve Hamburg of the Environmental Defense Fund, and he wrote a monograph called Playing God with Planet Earth. Tells you just from the title how much opposition there is to work on climate control. And here you see a 2008 decision by the people who control how much sewage, how much waste we can spill into the oceans. These people in 1972 decided that garbage and human waste must not be spilled into the oceans. We had the 1972 London Convention for preventing marine pollution. And in 2008, the environmental movement succeeded in applying its principles to iron fertilization of the Southern Ocean. So the same principle that we have used to put garbage in the oceans is now applied to iron fertilization. Tells you how much education we need. So here is now the summary of my message. We need to complement the successful energy conservation and renewable research, development, engineering with climate control research, development, and engineering. Note that I'm not saying anything about actually implementing climate control. We need research, development, and engineering. We must recognize that this is not to substitute for energy conservation, renewable energy, which will eventually allow us to maintain the temperature of our planet. But because there are powerful drivers, the accumulation of wealth, the growth of the number of people, the growth of per capita income, the atmospheric CO2 level will increase, and we must prepare for it. Humanity must prepare for the decades in which the CO2 levels can cause a climatic catastrophe. This is the bottom line of my message. We must prepare. And this should never, ever be thought of as a substitute for conserving or for renewables. It's not a substitute, it's complementing it. We have an extreme need to educate the public. The public must be informed. The public must be informed by the press and told by the political leaders that wealth and population growth drive the global warming. The first thing is people need to know why the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. Second, the public must be informed by the press and told by the political leaders that these are very powerful drivers and that today they overwhelm at least 9-fold, possibly 12-fold, the counter drivers of energy conservation and renewable energy. And the public must be educated by the press and the political leaders to make a knowledgeable decision, to have a knowledgeable debate on whether and when to implement actually climate engineering. There has to be a debate. The debate has to be started, and the debate must start with an educated public. So, global warming is not all bad. It's global warming that's bringing people out of poverty, bringing people out of famine, that makes the world more prosperous. And This was recognized by Svante Irenaeus. Now, all of you know about Svante Irenaeus equation, and what many of you may know, that Svante Irenaeus barely got a doctorate because he was advocating that ions are formed of molecules when they are dissolved in water. This was not well received. So he got from Uppsala his doctorate at the lowest possible level, at level 4, because it. Now, he wrote one of the great papers, one of the earliest ones, on reflecting sunlight by the clouds. He recognized that the world is warming. And being a Swede, as far as he was concerned, this wasn't so bad. He liked the world to become warmer. It didn't say a critical word in his 100-page long paper about global warming. He said, it's good. And he also said that how much the world will warm will depend very much on the reflectivity of clouds. He did get a Nobel Prize in 1903 in spite of everything. And that's my message today. Thank you.